This guy. Because, I mean, what are we reacting to? What are we reacting to? You're the one that put him in a position where he thought he was God and could call himself Jesus. And you're the one told a guy that writes musical lyrics that he...
You see what's going on now. Now Jim Carrey's gotten cloned.
Bro, here, I don't know, man. That shit looks weird.
On, man.
No, listen
Come
to me.
on, man.
Listen to me, man. That shit, it looks weird. It don't look weird to you?
The man got cloned.
I don't know about that, but his eye colors.
Something about that moment never sat right with people. When Jim Carrey stood under those lights and casually dropped what sounded like a joke about powerful secret groups, the room didn't react the way a comedy audience normally does. There was a pause, a hesitation, like everyone in that space felt something shift but didn't know how to respond to it. Then came the laughter, but even that felt delayed, almost artificial, like it was placed there afterward to smooth over something that wasn't supposed to land the way it did. At the time, most viewers brushed it off as classic Jim being weird, unpredictable, maybe even brilliant in a chaotic way. But years later, that same clip started circulating again under a very different lens. People weren't laughing anymore. They were analyzing. They were slowing it down, replaying his words, watching the expressions of the audience, the host, the energy in the room. And suddenly, it didn't feel like a performance. It felt like a moment that slipped through the cracks. Because what followed that appearance wasn't just another successful phase of his career. It was the opposite. The roles became less frequent. The spotlight dimmed. The same industry that once couldn't get enough of him slowly moved on without explanation. And that's where the real questions begin. Not about what he said, but about what happened after he said it. Because in Hollywood, timing is never random, and silence is never accidental. When someone at that level speaks out and then disappears, people eventually start connecting dots whether they're meant to or not at all.
Did Jim Carrey piss off the Illuminati? Did they swap out his body and his soul for this new version? Unlikely. But it's caused such a firestorm online that I'm here to investigate. And to be honest, I am the right guy for the job. I've researched this man's life story a million times. I actually produced...
Fast forward to 2026. And everything that once felt like a distant memory suddenly came rushing back into focus. Jim Carrey stepped onto the red carpet in Paris, an event meant to celebrate his legacy, his influence, his decades of unforgettable performances. On paper, it was a victory lap, the kind of recognition reserved for icons who shaped an entire generation. But within minutes, the narrative shifted completely. It wasn't about the award anymore. It wasn't about his career. It was about his face. Social media didn't take hours to react. It took seconds. Screenshots started circulating, comparisons appeared instantly, old clips placed side by side with new footage. And people weren't just pointing out minor differences. They were questioning everything. His expressions seemed restrained. His features looked altered in ways that didn't feel natural. But more than anything, it was the energy that felt unfamiliar. The chaotic, rubber-faced intensity that defined him for decades felt muted, almost controlled. And that's what made people uncomfortable. Because this wasn't just aging. It wasn't just lighting or angles. It felt like something deeper had changed. The comments became louder, more direct, less filtered. Some called it surgery. Others went further, suggesting things that sounded extreme at first but kept gaining traction. And while official sources dismissed it as nothing, the conversation refused to die down. Because when millions of people independently feel like something is off, ignoring it doesn't make it disappear. It only makes it grow. And that's exactly what happened next. The discussion exploded into something no one could easily contain.
It was an acceptance award he made for a Canadian award show, and I got some never-before-seen footage I'm going to share with you guys. Now, that was filmed just a few years ago in the comfort of his home, which I believe at the time was out in the UK, and he was in the middle of filming a passion project. Now, right out the gate, we get a close-up of his eyes, which are
different. His nose is different. Face is wider. The one I would believe more than him, you see Britney Spears?
Yeah.
You seen her videos? How'd she get a gap in her teeth? She never had that before.
Yeah, I don't know why.
They gave her my teeth? That shit's so weird to me, man. I listen, I don't know. I've never been invited to any Diddy parties. I've never been invited to any Illuminati parties. I don't know how it goes. I don't know what the weird conspiracy.
This is where Katt Williams enters the conversation, and when he does, people tend to listen differently. Not because he speaks louder, but because he speaks with a kind of precision that comes from experience. He's not guessing. He's not theorizing from the outside. He's someone who has spent decades inside the same system, watching how it operates, how it rewards, and more importantly, how it responds when someone refuses to play along. When Katt looked at what was happening with Jim Carrey, he didn't focus on appearances alone. He focused on patterns. According to him, Hollywood doesn't react to disruption in obvious ways. It doesn't always attack directly. Instead, it shifts things quietly, strategically, in ways that are hard to trace but impossible to ignore once you see them clearly. People who speak too openly don't always get silenced immediately. Sometimes they get distanced first. Opportunities slow down. Visibility decreases. The public narrative starts to shift. And eventually, if that person returns, they return differently. Not necessarily because they want to, but because the conditions have changed around them. Katt has hinted at this process multiple times, describing it as less of a punishment and more of a recalibration. And when you place Jim Carrey's timeline next to that framework, the similarities become difficult to dismiss. A public moment of speaking out, followed by a gradual disappearance, followed by a reappearance that feels altered. Not just physically but behaviorally. And that's the part that Katt keeps pointing back to, not what people are seeing but what they're sensing beneath it all.
Conspiracies are in Hollywood. I'm so far out of the loop. I'm kind of mad.
Right.
I thought I was doing well. I haven't been invited to anything.
So how did it feel? Because you went from this, like, I'm sure you was kind of somewhat popular, but now you got teeth and people like, look, like.
You got teeth and
Yeah, they'll be like, well, damn, Matt ain't too.
22, he said he was retiring from Hollywood, and nobody seems to be talking about anything but his face. Everyone thinks that it's a clone. He had major plastic surgery done. All anyone is talking about is this poor man's face. And to even muddy the waters further, Alexis Stone, who's this like uber famous SFX makeup artist and drag queen, posted on Instagram that they were in Paris as well, and they're known for dressing up as celebrities.
And Monique adds another layer to this story, one that shifts the focus away from speculation and towards something far more grounded. She doesn't talk about clones or extreme theories. She talks about consequences. According to her, Hollywood doesn't need dramatic tactics to control narratives. It uses something far more effective: access. The ability to open doors or quietly close them. She has spoken extensively about what happens when someone refuses to align with expectations. It doesn't always look like punishment from the outside. There are no headlines announcing it. No public statements. It's subtle. Calls stop coming in. Meetings don't happen. Projects disappear without explanation. And over time, the absence becomes its own message. Now apply that understanding to Jim Carrey's journey. A man who once openly criticized the system eventually steps away from it, intentionally or otherwise. Years pass with limited visibility. And then suddenly he's back. Not in a rebellious role, not challenging anything, but being honored by the very industry he once questioned. That shift is what Monique finds most telling. Because in her experience, returning to that space often requires compromise. Not necessarily in obvious ways, but in ways that reshape how a person presents themselves to the world. It's not about losing who you are entirely. It's about adjusting just enough to fit back into the system. And when audiences sense that adjustment, even if they can't fully explain it, they react. That reaction is exactly what we're seeing now: confusion mixed with curiosity, and a growing sense that something doesn't fully add up here.
Man, now that I look at him, I'm looking at him. The women, cause now you're a ladies guy.
Oh, well, that's very kind of you to say.
Yeah, you know it. Cause they're like, I don't know who rostered Matt or Pete. I think Matt might have Usain Bolted.
Usain Bolted.
One detail that keeps resurfacing in this conversation is something Jim Carrey himself once admitted: the use of decoys. At first glance, it sounds like a harmless strategy, even a clever one. Sending lookalikes in different directions to avoid media attention isn't unheard of at that level of fame. But when that idea is revisited in the current context, it starts to feel different. Because it introduces a concept that most people don't usually consider: how flexible public identity can become when perception is managed carefully. If a decoy can convincingly represent someone in one setting, then it raises questions about how often audiences rely on assumptions rather than verification. And while Jim mentioned it in a lighthearted way, the underlying implication is significant. It shows that separation between the real person and the public version of that person can exist more clearly than people realize. Now combine that with advancements in visual effects, prosthetics, and performance techniques, and the line becomes even harder to define. This doesn't mean anything extreme is happening, but it does mean that what people see isn't always as straightforward as it appears. And that uncertainty plays directly into why the Paris appearance triggered such a strong reaction. Because once the idea of controlled perception enters the conversation, every detail starts to feel open to interpretation. Expressions, movements, even presence itself. And in an industry built entirely on illusion, that's where things start to blur in ways that make people question what they're actually looking at more than ever before now. There's also the psychological side of this that often gets overlooked, but it might be one of the most important pieces of the puzzle. Jim Carrey has spent years talking about identity in ways that most celebrities never do. He's questioned the idea of the self, described personality as something constructed rather than fixed, and openly challenged the way people define who they are. At times, it sounded philosophical, even abstract. But in the context of everything happening now, those statements are being re-examined with a different perspective. Because if someone genuinely sees identity as fluid, as something that can shift and evolve beyond traditional boundaries, then change becomes easier to accept, even when it's drastic. That doesn't mean anything artificial is happening. It means the person themselves may no longer operate under the same framework that audiences expect. And that disconnect can feel unsettling. Fans hold on to a version of someone based on years of familiarity. When that version changes suddenly or significantly, it creates a sense of dissonance. Not because something is necessarily wrong, but because expectations are no longer being met. Jim Carrey's transformation, whether physical, emotional, or philosophical, challenges that expectation directly. And when you add in the external pressures of an industry known for shaping appearances and narratives, it becomes even more complex. What people are reacting to might not be one single factor, but a combination of internal evolution and external influence colliding at the same time. And that collision is what's creating the confusion we're seeing unfold across platforms right now. Another factor driving this entire situation is how quickly information spreads and evolves in the modern digital landscape. A single image can be captured, shared, analyzed, and debated by millions of people within minutes. And once that process begins, it doesn't stop. It builds. Every new perspective adds another layer, every comparison introduces another angle, and before long, the original moment becomes something much larger than it was initially. That's exactly what happened with Jim Carrey's appearance. It wasn't just seen. It was dissected. People zoomed in on facial features, slowed down video clips, compared expressions from decades apart. And while some of those comparisons were exaggerated, others raised questions that didn't have immediate answers. This environment creates a feedback loop where uncertainty feeds speculation, and speculation feeds even more attention. And in that space, narratives can form quickly, regardless of whether they are fully accurate or not. But here's the important part: the reaction itself is real. Even if the conclusions vary, the collective response indicates that something about the situation felt different enough to trigger widespread discussion. That doesn't happen without reason. It may not always lead to a clear explanation, but it highlights a gap between what people expect to see and what they actually see. And that gap is where curiosity grows. In this case, it's not just about one appearance. It's about how that appearance fits into a larger timeline that already had unanswered questions attached to it from years before this moment. Looking at the timeline as a whole is what makes this story difficult to ignore. It's not just one moment or one appearance that people are reacting to. It's the sequence of events leading up to it. A public statement that challenged powerful ideas, followed by a noticeable shift in career visibility, followed by a long period of relative absence, and then a return that feels different enough to spark global conversation. When these elements are viewed individually, they can each be explained in simple ways. Careers evolve. People take breaks. Appearances change over time. But when they are placed together in a specific order, they start to form a pattern that feels more intentional. And that's what Katt Williams keeps emphasizing. Not isolated events, but connected ones. According to him, understanding how influence works in Hollywood requires looking at long-term movement rather than short-term reactions. It's not about what happens immediately after someone speaks out. It's about what happens over years, how their position shifts, how their image evolves, and how their relationship with the industry changes. When applied to Jim Carrey, that perspective raises questions that go beyond surface-level explanations. It suggests that what people are seeing now may not be random at all, but part of a broader process that operates quietly in the background. Whether that process is intentional or simply a natural result of industry dynamics is still up for debate, but the pattern itself is what continues to draw attention. At this point, the conversation isn't really about proving one theory over another. It's about understanding why so many people feel like something doesn't fully make sense. That feeling doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from a combination of memory, expectation, and observation. People remember who Jim Carrey was not just visually but energetically. The way he moved, the way he spoke, the unpredictability that made him stand out in every role he played. When that version of someone changes significantly, it naturally creates a reaction. And in today's environment, that reaction becomes amplified instantly. But there's also a deeper layer to consider. Public figures don't exist in isolation. They are part of a system that influences how they are presented, how they are perceived, and how their narratives are shaped over time. That system doesn't need to control everything to have an impact. Even small adjustments can lead to noticeable differences when viewed on a large scale. So when people question what they're seeing, they're not necessarily jumping to extreme conclusions. They're responding to a shift that feels real to them, even if they can't fully explain it. And that's what keeps the discussion alive. Not definitive answers, but persistent questions. Questions about identity, influence, and the space between what is real and what is presented as real. And in a world where that line continues to blur, those questions are only becoming more relevant. So where does all of this leave us? Somewhere between certainty and speculation, between what can be proven and what can only be felt. Because at the end of the day, no official statement is going to fully resolve what people are seeing or sensing. The industry has already responded in the only way it usually does, by downplaying the conversation and moving forward as if nothing unusual happened. But the audience doesn't always move on so easily. Once a question takes hold, especially one tied to something as recognizable as a global icon, it tends to linger. And that's exactly what's happening here. Whether it's about appearance, behavior, or something deeper beneath the surface, people are paying attention in a way they weren't before. And maybe that's the most important part of this entire story. Not the conclusions, but the awareness. The willingness to look closer, to question more, to not immediately accept everything at face value. Because regardless of what the final explanation turns out to be, one thing is clear. This moment changed how people are looking at Hollywood, at celebrity, and at the idea of identity itself. And now the conversation is in your hands. What do you think really happened here? Is this just the natural evolution of a person over time, shaped by experience and environment? Or is there something more calculated happening behind the scenes? Drop your thoughts below, because this is one story that isn't ending anytime soon, and your perspective might just add the missing piece.